Welcome to the deep dive. You know, if you follow politics, especially in the US these days, you've probably had moments where you just stop and think. That doesn't add up.
Moments that defy any of the conventional logic we're taught.
Exactly. We're talking about these big structural inconsistencies,
Mhm.
political outcomes that seem completely illogical or, institutional behavior that just contradicts every standard model of checks and balances or public opinion.
Things like, why would a politician who is famously competitive concede a very narrow defeat only to immediately claim it was completely illegitimate? It's a contradiction.
It is. Or why do we sometimes see two administrations, supposedly on opposite ends of the spectrum, enacting policies that, when you look at them structurally, seem to advance very similar long-term goals? These are the things we're calling mainstream narrative plot holes.
And that's what we're here to tackle today.
That's right. So for this deep dive, we're taking on a really specific mission. We have a set of sources that lay out a highly specialized theoretical framework.
And this framework is grounded in some pretty serious stuff. We're talking systems theory, classic elite power structure studies, think C. Wright Mills' The Power Elite, and even modern network analysis.
And here's the twist. Our goal today is to move past treating this as just, some interesting speculation. For the next 30 or 40 minutes, we're going to approach this model as if it's the most likely, probable explanation for all those plot holes.
We're basically running a thought experiment. Let's assume it's true and see if these strange political events suddenly snap into a kind of logical, if very complex
No,
focus.
exactly. See if the puzzle pieces fit.
And that's really the key distinction here, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're not going to be looking at the formal political processes as they're officially described on paper.
No, this analysis is pushing us to look beyond the visible machinery. The vote counts, the press conferences, the bills being signed.
It's asking us to focus on the deeper, much less visible structures of influence, these underlying power negotiations, as the source calls them. The argument is that what we see, the formal processes, can sometimes just be, well, a facade.
A kind of political theater.
Precisely. And the real decisions, the real determination of outcomes, happens in what you could call the shadow economy of power. So our job today is to try and unpack the rules of that deeper game for you. So let's unpack this and define the foundation of the explanation.
Okay, so when we look at traditional political analysis, we're usually working with this idea of pluralism, that power is spread out, that public participation actually matters, that the institutions have robust checks and balances.
Right, the textbook model.
The textbook model. But the very existence of these plot holes suggests that maybe those mechanisms are compromised, or at least not the whole story. So for this framework to even begin to work, it has to introduce some alternative possibilities for how power really operates.
It has to lay out a new set of rules for the game.
So what are they? What are these four foundational assumptions that make up the rules of this deeper game?
Well, the framework really starts by shifting the entire basis of power away from popular will determining outcomes. Instead, it suggests we're looking at highly controlled environments. And the first, and maybe the most critical assumption, deals with the very infrastructure of power itself. It's called algorithmic influence.
Okay, that sounds significant.
It's a heavy lift, conceptually. I mean, it really asks us to completely abandon the idea that vote counting is this purely objective, mechanical process.
So what does it propose instead?
It posits that electoral systems, especially as they've become more and more reliant on electronic voting technologies, have these inherent vulnerabilities, either by design or through their operation, that allow for external calibration.
Calibration, you mean? Adjusting the results.
We're talking about the capability to influence or fine-tune the results. That's the term the analysis uses.
Fine-tuning is a very generous way to put that. How do the sources justify such a huge claim?
They do it by drawing a direct parallel to the history of these exact same technologies. They were deployed in international contexts for years.
Right, in other countries.
Exactly. The sources note that these technologies were often used in, say, fragile or transitioning democracies for what was officially termed strategic purposes, or, get this, outcome stabilization.
Outcome stabilization. Wow. So if the technology was historically used to stabilize an outcome, the framework argues that we have to assume the same capability exists here at home.
That's the logical leap. If it was used overseas to maybe prevent a destabilizing landslide victory for an unwanted candidate by just nudging the result into a safer, narrower margin, then the mechanism exists. It's a proven capability.
So what does stabilization actually mean in practice? Are we talking about just setting a range, like ensuring the final vote stays within a 52-48 split? Or does it mean full-on predetermination of the winner?
The analysis suggests it's a spectrum of control, but the application implies a very high degree of it. In the context of these plot holes, stabilization means ensuring the structural outcome is achieved.
The outcome that's necessary for the long-term strategic agenda of whatever the dominant coalition is.
Exactly. Regardless of what the public opinion polls are saying, if a result needs to be narrow to set up a future legal challenge, the algorithm stabilizes it there. If it needs to be a decisive win to project authority and legitimacy, it stabilizes it there.
So the physical act of voting and counting becomes almost secondary to the design of the calibration itself.
That's the argument.
Mhm.
And this capability, according to the framework, is what allows these super-governmental actors we're going to talk about to operate with such confidence.
Which that leads perfectly into the second assumption, which has to be how they sell that calibrated reality to all of us, this idea of narrative engineering.
Mm.
And we're all used to talking about media bias or, partisan news channels, but this concept sounds much, much deeper.
It is. The framework describes the media's evolution as moving completely past simple reportage and becoming a functional extension of authoritative entities.
So they're not just reporting on the reality.
They're the mechanism for shaping the reality that the algorithm has already produced.
And this isn't just accidental bias then.
No, the analysis is very clear on this. It's not about organic or accidental bias. It's presented as a structural necessity for the entire system to work. Once the outcome is calibrated, that's assumption one, the narrative has to be deployed. That's assumption two, to make sure the public's interpretation of that outcome aligns with the political goals.
So if the system needs to seem legitimate, the media frames the result as normal, a victory for democracy.
Right. But if the system needs to erode legitimacy, which is what the framework argues happened in 2020, then the media's job is to frame the outcome as highly contested, deeply polarizing, which has the effect of strengthening those factional boundaries.
So the media's role becomes purely functional. It's about managing the public's cognitive dissonance. That's that gap between what people feel happened and the reality that is politically necessary.
You've got it. That's the core idea.
And this brings us to the third piece of this whole puzzle, coordinated foresight. And this one seems to be about the behavior of elites, but not politicians necessarily. We're talking financial, tech, bureaucratic elites.
That's right. The people behind the curtain, so to speak.
The framework says that if you see these high-level actors expressing this unwavering, rock-solid confidence in an election prediction, even when all the public metrics like polls are volatile or pointing the other way.
Which happens all the time.
All the time. This framework says we should interpret that certainty as evidence of coordinated foresight among this group they call supragovernmental actors.
Let's just pause on that term for a second. Supra-governmental, that's a really heavy term. It implies actors whose power actually transcends the formal, visible structure of the government itself.
So who are we talking about?
It could be incredibly influential. Private sector leaders, heads of powerful, non-elected global organizations, maybe figures adjacent to the intelligence community.
Yeah.
Their confidence in this model isn't because they're great at reading polls.
It's because they have control over the inputs.
Exactly. They are leveraging the systemic levers we just talked about in assumption one.
Yeah.
And they are masters of the narrative tools in assumption two. They aren't predicting the future. They are confirming a designed outcome.
So their certainty is, in itself, the evidence of their asymmetric access to information and, well, power.
That's the argument. It's a signal.
Okay, but if they're all so coordinated and powerful, why do we sometimes see these massive upsets? Why don't they just always get their way? Which, of course, brings us to assumption four, intervening coalitions.
Right. This is where the model gets really dynamic.
This assumption explains that these supergovernmental actors are not one single monolithic group. They're often divided into competing coalitions.
So the system isn't a simple dictatorship. It's an arena of constant contestation, a struggle between these highly organized, deeply networked factions.
And the sources point to a very specific example here.
They do. They specifically cite the 2016 U.S. presidential election upset as a prime example of a successful intervention. One coalition managed to override or seriously disrupt the intended plan of what was, at that time, the dominant faction.
And that explains why the outcomes aren't always so smooth or predictable from the outside.
Exactly. They are the result of these intense negotiations, these strategic maneuvers, and sometimes a successful real-time deployment of influence that shifts the algorithmic calibration or completely overrides the narrative engineering of a rival group. It's a power struggle.
So there are the rules of the deep game. Algorithmic control, narrative management, elite foresight, and competing coalitions. So now we have to position the central figure in all this recent political drama, Donald Trump. How does this framework analyze his role in this complex structure?
Well, the analysis is really insistent on this point. He is not viewed as a singular, autonomous political agent acting purely on his own ambition. That's the traditional view.
So what is he then?
Instead, he's analyzed as a nodal point. That's the term they use. A nodal point in a complex and strategically vital network of alliances.
Like a major hub or interchange on a massive highway system?
That's a perfect analogy. A single car doesn't define the whole system, but that interchange is what facilitates the flow of tremendous amounts of traffic and power. His capabilities, his political resilience, his incredible fundraising, his maneuvering, are all interpreted as flowing directly from the vast web of resources, technological, financial, informational, that his aligned coalition brings to the table.
So this nodal position is what enables these highly strategic maneuvers across different election cycles.
Correct. And it's what explains why his actions, like for instance what happened with the 2020 defeat, can seem so illogical when you're just looking at them through the narrow lens of traditional personality-driven politics.
Okay, so let's apply this very sophisticated lens to that first big plot hole, 2020. The standard narrative is pretty simple, right? He lost the election, he challenged it, he failed, and then he eventually left office.
Mm. But the central contradiction is still there.
It absolutely is.
Mm.
Why would a figure who is so invested in the idea of winning and so publicly confident in his claims of systemic fraud ultimately agree to leave office despite such a narrow margin? This framework we're exploring suggests the loss was actually a calculated strategic reversal.
A feature, not a bug.
Exactly.
And that's where this concept of the deliberate concession really comes into play. If we use the framework's core assumptions, specifically that Trump is aligned with a powerful but at that moment disadvantaged countervailing coalition, that's assumption 4, then the 2020 outcome is seen as a tactical retreat.
A retreat. Why?
Crucially, this is all based on a game theoretic model, and it involves what's called asymmetric information. One faction, the rival coalition, had superior access to the systemic levers at that critical moment, particularly the digital infrastructures we talked about in Assumption 1.
So they were outgunned, technologically speaking.
In that specific moment, yes. So when you're facing a situation where an immediate outright victory can't be guaranteed, or at least couldn't be sustained without triggering massive, immediate, and very visible instability, forcing a narrow engineered loss becomes the optimal long-term strategy for Trump's coalition.
Hang on, how does forcing a loss make any logical sense? If they're this powerful coalition, why not just fight for the win?
Because the objective wasn't about short-term office retention. It was about long-term systemic erosion and strategic positioning for the future. The sources suggest that the rival faction, with that superior tech leverage at the time, was already positioned to secure a win. Trying to directly override that advantage might have led to an immediate chaotic failure, which could have compromised the coalition's future ability to operate.
So instead of a messy public fight, they might lose anyway.
Exactly. Instead, the defeat was engineered, in part by their own coalition, collaborating internally to use the preemptive calibration of those digital systems to yield a very specific result, a narrow defeat. It had to be close enough to cry foul, convincingly, but just definitive enough to ensure the transfer of power actually happened.
And this is where the strategic genius of it, if we accept this model, really comes into focus. The decision to concede wasn't just about losing. It was coupled with this move to actively embed traceable artifacts within the electoral system itself.
This is not just losing, this is weaponizing the loss.
We really need to spend a moment on what that means in practice, because this is a really unique idea from the sources. Traceable artifacts are these deliberately generated pieces of evidence of impropriety.
That's exactly it. We're talking about designing the loss to produce specific, identifiable statistical anomalies.
Like what?
Maybe an anomalous spike in ballot tabulation at a very precise hour in a very specific county. Or time-stamped data logs that seem to show a procedural break in the chain of custody, but only after the vote had already been processed digitally. Things that look suspicious.
And the key here is that it's intentional.
The intentionality is everything. These artifacts are designed to be almost impossible to distinguish from genuine error or just organic fraud if you're only using superficial methods to look at them. But for the coalition that embedded them, they serve as a kind of proprietary evidence, ammunition for the long war ahead.
So the coalition willingly gave up the short-term prize, the presidency itself, in order to acquire the evidence they needed to destroy the institutional legitimacy of the entire electoral process over the next 4 years.
The loss became a controlled experiment that was designed to generate forensic data.
Which completely reframes the entire post-election period of challenges and legal fights. It's a classic application of rational choice theory from political science, where actors will forego an immediate short-term benefit
In this case, the executive office.
for a much larger, delayed strategic advantage.
And the number one overriding objective was the profound and sustained erosion of institutional legitimacy. By continuously casting doubt on the entire voting infrastructure, using these strategically manufactured artifacts, the goal was to achieve one thing above all else: mobilize a deeply skeptical, highly energized grassroots base for all the future cycles.
So that political skepticism becomes a kind of long-term resource for the coalition.
Exactly. And this also explains the sheer intensity of the public fight. Trump's constant contestation, the rallies, the legal challenges. The sources argue we shouldn't analyze that as a genuine immediate effort to actually reclaim the office,
But rather,
as a performative element. This performance was absolutely essential for reinforcing the coalition's cohesion and cementing that factional loyalty. It gave the grassroots base a tangible, emotional rallying point, ensuring the entire network stayed engaged and funded, and it prepared the political ground for future maneuvers from a new position of systemic skepticism.
and this whole strategy hinges on assumption two, narrative engineering, to manage the public perception of the fallout.
The media's role was absolutely essential in splitting the public interpretation of these artifacts.
Right. The media system acted like a narrative amplifier, just disseminating these highly selective interpretations. They might focus only on the legal court cases that failed, while completely minimizing the statistical or procedural anomalies being pointed out.
The event was framed as an aberration rather than a design. So they successfully convinced one part of the population that the system worked just fine, and the other part that the system was hopelessly and completely corrupt.
Which ensures maximum polarization.
And that heightened polarization is the desired outcome. The source analysis shows that this bifurcated public discourse just strengthens factional loyalty on both sides. The system becomes less about persuading the middle and more about just confirming the pre-existing beliefs of your base.
Which effectively cleared the stage for the next phase of the plan, which required an opposition figure to be holding the visible reins of government.
We transition now to what might be the most counterintuitive plot hole of all: the Biden interlude. If the rival coalition successfully captured the executive branch in 2020, why did so many policies enacted by that supposedly opposed administration sometimes appear to structurally advance the long-term underlying goals of the very network that just conceded power?
It's a huge contradiction.
And the framework resolves this using the concept of stealth authoritarianism.
This is a really complex idea. It's suggesting that despite all the overt political fighting we saw, there was some kind of subterranean coordination, or at least a structural inertia, that kept things moving in a certain direction.
That's it. And the hypothesis here is that the executive figurehead, in this case the Biden administration, functions as a mediated entity.
A mediated entity, what does that mean?
The source material draws parallels to historical archetypes of, say, controlled or managed leadership. The kinds you see during authoritarian transitions or in hybrid regimes, where the person you see on TV isn't the true locus of structural power.
So the concept implies that the figurehead's main value is their function, not their personal agency or ideology.
Precisely. Their primary utility is function. And this allows Trump's aligned coalition to strategically leverage this period of being in visible opposition to embed policies that consolidate power indirectly. This aligns perfectly with a political science concept introduced by a scholar named Virol: constitutional retrogression.
Constitutional retrogression.
Yeah, it means the shift toward more centralized or less democratic governance doesn't happen in one big revolutionary moment. It's not a coup. It happens incrementally through subtle, legal, systemic changes that are all masked by the appearance of normal democratic processes.
And because the opposing party is technically in office, the measures look like legitimate responses to crises or just standard regulatory updates.
Exactly.
Can you give us some concrete conceptual examples of this kind of policy alignment? How would a rival administration actually advance the previous network's structural goals?
The sources suggest thinking about surface-level reforms. So let's say expansions in digital surveillance or new economic oversight related to something like a central bank digital currency or even new national security measures about digital identity.
Okay, things that sound reasonable on the surface.
Right. These policies, enacted under the banner of stabilizing the economy or enhancing security by the opposition party, might inadvertently or even deliberately align perfectly with the network's longer-term objectives. For instance, a new federal cybersecurity regulation that standardizes state election systems. It might appear totally nonpartisan. But what if the technical specifications of that new regulation inadvertently weaken federal electoral oversight in favor of more state-level control? Or what if it centralizes voting data in a way that's easily exploitable by the coalition that has the technological dominance we talked about in Assumption 1?
Then the policy, despite being passed by the opposition, actually advances the entrenched agenda.
Precisely. The key is that the goals are structural. Things like weakening democratic accountability or enhancing executive prerogatives, those things benefit any centralized power structure, no matter who is visibly in charge at the moment.
This makes Trump's very visible, very continuous public opposition to the Biden administration fascinating. In this model, that opposition isn't seen as just genuine political warfare.
No, it's analyzed as a dialectical tool to refine these measures.
A dialectical tool. What does
Yeah.
that mean?
By so vehemently opposing an action, the network ensures two things. First, their grassroots support remains fired up and mobilized. And second, the policy being enacted by the opposition, when it faces all this public critique, is ultimately optimized to achieve the underlying structural goal while maintaining maximum distance and deniability for the primary actor.
So if the opposition is forced to defend the policy by saying, see, even Trump hates it, it paradoxically just legitimizes the policy's structural usefulness.
Exactly, it's a brilliant maneuver.
Yeah.
And this influence is maintained because the network is resilient. It persists through what the sources call interstitial channels.
The cracks and seams in the formal institutional armor.
Perfect way to put it. We're talking about key judicial appointments that were made in prior cycles that continue to cement ideological influence for decades, or critical state-level legislation. Often focus on these boring procedural changes to election law or regulatory frameworks, and deep, often non-transparent private sector partnerships that blend state and corporate surveillance powers.
So these channels ensure the continuity of the agenda, even when the rival faction is holding the White House.
It's like a massive submarine moving silently beneath the surface of all the visible political waves.
The sources introduce a really powerful metaphor here, even if it's not literal. The clone metaphor.
Right, it's an analysis of a political phenomenon, not a literal claim.
The clone is interpreted as this highly curated public persona that's designed purely for functional utility. The analysis notes that you see biographical discontinuities, visible inconsistencies in behavior, or major policy shifts in the executive figurehead, but they're largely overlooked by the public.
Because the figurehead's functional role is what matters.
Yeah.
Maintaining the illusion of stability and, more importantly, facilitating that policy entrenchment. That functional utility is paramount.
Yes, and this perfectly mirrors dynamics that we've seen in hybrid regimes all over the world, where these periods of apparent opposition serve a crucial, even necessary function.
They're used as operational windows for the subterranean consolidation of deeper power structures. The visible, chaotic political drama we see on the news every day serves primarily as a distraction from the quiet, persistent policy work being done beneath the surface.
Ensuring that when the original network is ready to return to power, the foundation of centralized control is actually stronger than it was before they left.
Precisely.
So if the last 4 years were defined by this strategic reversal and stealth consolidation between these warring coalitions, why does the framework suggest such a high level of confidence among certain elites about a preordained outcome for 2024? That's the next big plot hole we have to resolve.
And that confidence, again, isn't based on reading public polling data. It's derived from what the framework claims is informational and technological dominance.
So it's about capability.
It's all about capability. Within this complex systems model, the 2024 election is seen as the culminating arena of this intense interfactional contestation. It's the big showdown between the competing supragovernmental coalitions we identified back in Assumption 4. And the key factor is the shift in technological leverage.
Okay, so walk me through that.
Remember, back in 2020, Trump's coalition was modeled as having the inferior access to the systemic levers. The whole premise for 2024 is the reverse. The assumption of victory is rooted in the belief that the aligned coalition now possesses decisive asymmetric capabilities.
A technological or informational dominance that allows them to neutralize whatever the other side is trying to do.
That's it. This is a massive extension of Assumption 1, algorithmic influence.
So we've basically moved from simple algorithmic calibration to a full-blown algorithmic arms race. What specific countermeasures or anticipatory interventions are being deployed to ensure this supposedly preordained outcome, according to the source material?
The analysis describes some highly sophisticated strategies. This includes deploying complex algorithmic safeguards that are designed to actively counteract any rival calibration efforts. It suggests a kind of continuous technological warfare happening completely behind the scenes.
Real-time monitoring of voting infrastructure.
Right, but not just to detect manipulation. It's being used to actively override manipulations deployed by the competing faction in real time.
So the confidence comes from the belief that they can stop the other side from pulling the same kind of engineered narrow defeat that was executed against them in 2020.
Exactly. They are neutralizing the opposing coalition's functional access to those systemic levers. And this capability for real-time monitoring and counter-manipulation is what provides the basis for the predictive certainty you see from aligned elites. It mirrors the surprise and the underlying informational advantage that was seen in the 2016 upset.
This whole structural power game seems very aligned with some concepts in political sociology.
It is. You can draw a direct line here to the work of Pierre Bourdieu and his field theory. For listeners who might not be familiar, Bourdieu treats power not as a thing individuals hold, but as a structure, a field of competition, kind of like a marketplace or a sports league. And in this political field, these coalitions are mobilizing various forms of capital.
And we should be clear, we're not just talking about money when we say capital, right?
Absolutely not. The framework is very specific about this. It details the mobilization of technological capital, that's the mastery of the electoral infrastructure itself. Informational capital, the ability to deploy these targeted large-scale disinformation cascades designed to influence voter behavior and perception. And social capital, the cohesion and organizational strength of their supra-governmental network.
And these different capitals are deployed with a very specific goal in mind.
Yes, specifically to alter the habitus of electoral participation. The habitus is Bourdieu's term for the set of ingrained dispositions and perceptions that voters have about the political process itself.
So, by generating these sophisticated disinformation campaigns, the coalition further fractures the public's perception of electoral integrity.
Which ensures that the population responds to whatever the eventual outcome is, whatever the digital systems produce, in a highly predictable, highly factionalized, and therefore easily manageable way.
The implications of this kind of technological superiority are staggering. I mean, they fundamentally challenge every pluralist model we use to understand democracy, like Robert Dahl's idea of polyarchy, which depends on multiple competing power centers and being responsive to the public will.
It really does.
Because if electoral predictability is derived not from the genuine popular will, but from these coalition equilibria, the balance of power between these rival technological authorities, it just highlights the profound vulnerabilities in our digitized political systems.
And in this framework, the assumed 2024 outcome is framed very explicitly. It's not seen as just a victory. It's framed as a corrective restoration. Yes. It legitimizes a major shift in dominance among these rival authorities, one that was secured primarily through technological mastery.
And the corrective part is essential, isn't it? It suggests that the four-year interlude was this unstable period of managed consolidation, and the 2024 cycle is what's necessary to return the underlying network structure to its dominant natural state.
Exactly. To ensure the continued pursuit of that long-term agenda that was being quietly consolidated during the entire period of proxy governance.
Okay, so we have to address the final, and maybe the most structurally alarming plot hole in this whole narrative, the long-term vision. If this network achieves dominance through all the methods we've just described, how do they overcome the ultimate constitutional barrier formal term limits to ensure they retain power beyond a theoretical second term, so post-2029?
This is where the framework really leans into concepts of systemic resilience and deep institutional capture. Traditional analysis would just say, well, the Constitution stops this cold.
Yep.
End of story. This alternative model, however, posits that retaining office beyond that second term becomes entirely feasible. And it becomes feasible through either institutional reconfiguration or crisis exploitation, all because of the immense power of this supergovernmental oversight.
So what's the theoretical model for that?
The specific model they use here is Shedler's work on electoral authoritarianism. This describes regimes that maintain the facade of democracy. They still hold elections, they keep some formal institutions around, but they completely subvert their functional capacity.
So term limits aren't subverted through some illegal outright power grab.
No, it's done through legal, extra-legal, or what they call emergent mechanisms that exploit existing loopholes and, crucially, manufactured consent.
So we need to detail the specific strategies the analysis suggests for getting around these limits. This has to involve exploiting all the gray areas in our institutional architecture.
It does. First, the most direct path would be coalition-orchestrated amendments to constitutional provisions. If the aligned network can achieve the necessary level of control over state legislatures and Congress, perhaps through the continued use of their technological and informational capital, they could, in theory, redefine term limits or executive powers. It would take time, but the power geometries established by 2024 would make it plausible.
Okay, what's the second strategy?
The second is leveraging controlled legislatures to redefine executive durations. This might involve reinterpreting existing statutes about executive capacity during a declared national emergency, or using controlled state compacts to redefine the nature of the presidential office itself. This could allow for extensions under very specific, maybe even fabricated conditions. The complexity of U.S. federalism offers a lot of pressure points for this kind of thing.
And the third, and I'm guessing most rapid, strategy.
That involves the invocation of emergency protocols, leveraging pretexts like a continuous national security threat, an unprecedented economic collapse, or even a major climate crisis scenario to suspend electoral cycles entirely.
So using existing constitutional provisions for emergency powers, but repurposing them to ensure the continuity of the current executive beyond their formal limits.
And this leverages all of that systemic erosion of legitimacy that was built up over the previous decade.
And even if the primary actor does have to leave office, the framework assumes this oligarchic continuity through something called a proxy chain.
Right. If the executive absolutely must step down because of some immovable legal constraint, proxy successors would simply be installed who function as mere extensions of the primary actor, allowing them to maintain de facto control.
And assumption two, the media as a tool for narrative engineering has to become absolutely indispensable for this to work indefinitely.
It's the linchpin. The media's role would be to construct these compelling narratives of the primary actor's indispensability.
They would argue that only the continued guidance or oversight, maybe even indirect control by the original nodal point, even through a proxy, can navigate the constant crises, whether they're manufactured or real.
And that narrative ensures public acquiescence to these shifting legal boundaries.
And the technological facets from Assumption 1 provide the bedrock for this whole thing, this idea of perpetual outcome calibration.
That's the key. The ability to digitally monitor, adjust, and essentially guarantee electoral outcomes means the network can ensure that only fully aligned figures prevail indefinitely, whether it's the primary actor or their hand-picked successor.
So the sophisticated digitized systems that we were once told were enhancing democratic efficiency are repurposed to guarantee predetermined political inertia and outcome control.
And that's the end game. Ultimately, this highly structuralist model posits that public participation is largely just a mask for these elite pacts, these backroom agreements made between supergovernmental actors that perpetually maintain oligarchic continuity.
So in this analysis, democracy is just reduced to a contingent construct.
That's the term. It's fundamentally adaptable and flexible, based entirely on the underlying power geometries and the dominant balance of technological and informational capital between these rival authorities. The visible political system is simply the stage where an entrenched agenda is continuously executed.
It is a comprehensive and frankly a pretty challenging framework to get your head around.
Okay.
We started with these plot holes. The strategic concession of 2020, the surprising structural alignment during the Biden interlude, and that elite certainty surrounding 2024. And by adopting this lens, one that focuses on algorithmic influence, narrative engineering, coordinated foresight, and intercoalitional contestation, we do find a cohesive, logical explanation for events that are otherwise almost impossible to rationalize within the standard democratic narrative.
What's so fascinating here is how the analysis forces us to probe what it calls the interstices of democracy. It demands that we at least acknowledge the possibility of levels of opacity and agency that operate entirely beyond our visible formal institutions.
It's a whole different way of thinking.
It is. By embracing this kind of approach, we have to shift our thinking away from simple linear cause and effect. A leads to B, and start considering nonlinear paths, hidden variables, and the idea that a strategic retreat in one election cycle can be the calculated prerequisite for systemic dominance in the next.
It's a very sobering perspective to view the political landscape not as a competition for popular votes, but as this continuous negotiation between rival authorities who are using technological and informational dominance to guarantee structural outcomes.
And this raises a really important question for you, the listener, to explore on your own. If rival authorities can effectively negotiate and preordain outcomes using this kind of dominance, what is the functional difference between popular sovereignty, the actual will of the people, and a system that's just optimized for policy inertia?
That is a deep question.
And if the results are guaranteed by technology, what metrics beyond the electoral tally itself should we even be monitoring to gauge the true fragility and adaptability of our governance structures? Something for you to mull over or explore on your own.